All I had, this place gave me.
We've never had a territory of 7.5 million people who have lived and breathed their basic freedom, having that taken away from them.
I watched this man willingly give up the life of a billionaire to become a dissident.
I will have to fight to the last day.
He's probably the most famous newspaperman jailed in the world.
I owe freedom my life.
You're listening to the Exploration Films podcast.
He had every reason to leave and a ticket if he wanted it. But Jimmy Lai, the factory kid turned billionaire retailer, founder of Apple Daily, a newspaper that gave Hong Kong a voice, stayed. The documentary, The Hong Konger, is the story of why. Arrested on August 10th, 2020 under Hong Kong's national security law and found guilty last month on December 25th, 2025 after a marathon trial, his case asks a blunt question. What does freedom cost when the bill comes due? This film plays like a thriller, except it's real. A city built on the rule of law becomes a test case. Do promises mean anything when power is on the line? Can a free press survive when the truth gets expensive? And what does one man's choice to say to the rest of us who love comfort more than courage? Today on the Exploration Films podcast, we dive into the Hong Konger, how Hong Kong became Asia's hub, why it mattered to markets, families, and faith, where the early cracks showed, and what could have been done differently to keep it free. I interviewed two voices who know this from the inside. Mary Kissel, former State Department senior advisor and longtime Wall Street Journal editor in Asia, and William Bill McGurn, the Wall Street Journal's Main Street columnist and Jimmy Lai's close friend and godfather. And there's a deeper echo here. The closing line of America's Declaration of Independence, quote, "We mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor," unquote. Jimmy made that kind of pledge in our time, and he's paying the cost. As you listen, would you pray for Jimmy by name and for his wife, Teresa, for strength, protection, and release? I'm Steve Ryder. This is the Exploration Films podcast, and this is The Hong Konger. Bill McGurn, thank you for being on Exploration Films podcast. I love the film, The Hong Konger, and I absolutely love I could tell your love for Jimmy Lai. So how do you know him? Who are you and how do you know him?
Well, I was based in Hong Kong for more than a decade, over two different stints. In my second stint in the 90s, I met Jimmy Lai. We profiled him for the paper. He was then the owner of a very popular clothing store called Giordano. It was kind of like the Gap or Levi's or something. It was simple clothes, sporty clothes, brightly colored, and especially good prices. And so we profiled it because Hong Kong didn't have that. They had things like you could get for $1, maybe this jacket at a sidewalk bin, but you couldn't go out looking for a blue sports coat. You have to take whatever you got. Or you could go to the upscale hotels and they have really expensive shops, international labels, but there was nothing for the masses of people in between. So people forget this. Before Jimmy Lai got famous for his papers and his entrepreneurship and advocacy of democracy, he was really making waves as an entrepreneur. He founded a chain. It was immensely popular. We got to know him through that. And the friendship grew. I would say it grew mostly through our wives, because my wife, Julie, and his wife, Teresa, they hit it off immediately. I would always be friends with Jimmy, even if they weren't friends or never met. but I'd be more like a work associate or something. We wouldn't have had the family ties. I mean, I'm Jimmy's godfather. His wife is my daughter's godmother. My wife is his daughter's godmother. So we're very intertwined.
Hong Kong has no natural resources. It's basically a pile of rocks in the South China Sea.
Part of it had been acquired in perpetuity after the Opium Wars in the early part of the 19th century. But the largest part of it, the so-called New Territories, had been acquired on a 99-year lease.
It had been really a fishing village up into that time. It was just a regular colonial outpost. You couldn't say that Hong Kong was much different than really any place else in Asia where the Brits were. But after World War II, Hong Kong became a destination for immigrants, and they were Chinese immigrants.
The British did not give us democracy.
You know, they didn't have full freedom under British colonial rule.
But British gave us all the institutions of freedom. The rule of law, the human right, the free speech, the free market.
We had all this institution that protect our freedom and let our mind, our resourcefulness flourish.
So let's talk about Hong Kong itself. One country, two systems is what we were told when the handover happened. So what exactly happened in Hong Kong that made it so precarious ultimately for Jimmy?
Well, some of us were skeptical about that promise. I mean, to believe one country, two systems, you have to believe the communist government is going to rule or not rule over an entity of such freedom as Hong Kong. And I think now we see inevitably that's bound to fail. But there was a lot of talk. The phrase was the tail wagging the dog, Hong Kong wagging China's tail. And I think it was okay up until Xi Jinping. There were a lot of little things along the way, but I think Xi Jinping really changed the equation. They, are going back on their promise of one country, two systems. Every day it looks more like one country, one system, and they picked the bad system to be the one system.
Did we miss early signs?
No, I think they were there and they were covered. I think a lot of people glossed over them because, if you lived in Hong Kong, it was such an extraordinary place with extraordinary freedoms and very happy place. And I think it was very hard for people to imagine that going away. Would China, for example, the way they put it, would they kill the goose that laid the golden eggs? Well, yes, apparently they're willing to do that.
How did Hong Kong become this Asian hub?
Largely by accident. It was kind of an accident of colonialism. The British Navy wanted outposts and they got it. And what you saw is that Chinese people granted freedom under the British rule, and especially the British rule of law. They prospered. They did extraordinary things and they got rich. Not just the British got rich, the Chinese residents got rich. It was really an incredible place. I mean, I look back now and it's sad to see it straggled. It was just for a brief period of time, maybe about 100 years. It was just a shining light.
Could the British have said, yeah, we're not going to hand this over? These people deserve freedom. And
there were some people that make the argument. In retrospect, I would like them to have tried. I think the fallback is they could have said no to Chinese attempts to water down the agreement they signed, which happened from the start. It's a long story, but after they signed it, basically the British did everything Chinese wanted. And not until Chris Patten was appointed governor in the 90s did the British try to claw back some of the things they'd given to China, surrendered to China. But looking at it historically, it just seems a tragedy. Hong Kong had freedom for a brief period of time. There was a guy I knew when I lived in Hong Kong the first time in the 80s, and his father had covered the moving, I think, of gold to Taiwan from China. He was a journalist. And he said, remember, a lot of Chinese patriots didn't like Hong Kong because it was colonial. It was a kind of embarrassment to them. And it's still an embarrassment that in that colonial place, ruled by a foreign country, Chinese people are freer than they've ever been anywhere in the world. Anyway, this guy said Hong Kong was the only Chinese society that ever delivered the great freedom from the midnight knock on the door. Now that midnight knock on the door came for Jimmy Lai.
We'll get to that in a minute. How did Jimmy get involved in media? He was a clothing guy.
Yeah, he was more accurately, he was an entrepreneur. He has a restless spirit and he has a really inquisitive mind. He didn't finish, I don't think he finished grade school, but he's had friendships with Milton Friedman, discussed economics, took him to China for one trip and so forth. So he's very inquisitive. If you know Jimmy, everything's inquisitive. He has dinners and at his table, all sorts of people, and he wants to hear what they have to say. So he's very inquisitive. And I think he grew to appreciate Tiananmen Square was a turning point for a lot of people in Hong Kong. They really saw what China was, that it hadn't left this behind, that it could be brutal and everything. And Jimmy became a leading voice for freedom. What Hong Kong people like Jimmy thought is, well, we got the guarantees of freedom in the joint declaration that agreed to send Hong Kong back to China, as well as in the basic law, the rules that were governing Hong Kong. But, now we can see if there's no real willingness and spirit to enforce freedom, you're not going to have it.
This praise is freedom gave me.
Everything he has is actually granted by Hong Kong.
I owe freedom my life.
He want to do something to pay tribute to Hong Kong.
Jimmy never had to work again. He had made plenty of money. He could have retired years and years and years ago, enjoyed a very nice life, but it was about more than that to him.
I asked myself, I make enough money. If I just go on making money, it doesn't mean anything to me. But if I go into the media business, that I deliver information, which is choice, and choice is freedom.
He started the magazine, the Next magazine.
I call it Next because I want my next life, my next business. So 5 years later, we launched the newspaper. The idea came to me to call it Apple.
The Apple Daily newspaper, which was the only pro-democracy Chinese language daily newspaper.
Who is Jimmy behind closed doors?
I think he's pretty much the same guy that you see. He's just so outgoing and inquisitive. My kids loved him. We adopted 3 kids from China, and the first 2 we did while we were over there. And we were over there, every week, sometimes 2 or 3 times, because our wives had a lot in common. Our kids liked playing with each other. He's just a man of no pretenses. He grew up in the gutter and he triumphed. And you know what? He's outspoken. He owned a newspaper, and that's what really got him attention. But there are thousands of people with Jimmy's story, rags to riches. It was real and palpable. So that's what I remember Hong Kong as.
What are some of those stories behind the scenes?
When they interviewed him at my magazine, the Far Eastern Economic Review, for a story on his clothing store, Giordano. He took an Italian name because he thought for fashion it was better than a Chinese name. And it was after a pizzeria in New York, Giordano's. So he used that name and he sold things at a good price to the middle class. He was the first really in Hong Kong to cater to the middle class. Other people catered to the very rich or the very poor. But there was nothing for the middle class, by which I mean something at good prices, good quality, and consistency. Like he could go there, and it was in many ways, it was like McDonald's. You go into any McDonald's, it's going to be clean. The bathrooms will be clean. The food will be the same as it was in the last McDonald's. And he brought that to Giordano, and then he brought it to the newspapers.
So earlier this week, December 15th, it was announced that Jimmy was convicted. In 2020, he was actually arrested. Why didn't he leave Hong Kong when he had the chance and be this voice in a free country speaking into China?
It's a good question. A lot of his friends wish he had. But anyone who knows Jimmy knows he would never abandon the people of Hong Kong. He didn't want to be the rich guy who saved himself and left other people holding the bag.
Wow.
It's very simple. I'm sure it was an agonizing choice for his family, his wife, and his friends. But that's how Jimmy thinks. And I personally believe he kind of trapped himself by, speaking out, saying he would never leave to make it harder for him to run away when the temptation was greater. He's an extraordinary man.
What's the hardest question you've asked yourself as a friend and as a journalist?
Well, I ask myself every day, can I do more? Because so many people depended on this guy. He was so generous to a lot of people, and so many people ate at his dinner table and came to see him and so forth, now deny knowing him. He's had incredible support. Jimmy, is Catholic. He has a lot of support from the Christian community around the world. And also, frankly, just, in publicizing his cause, it's a lot easier than some of my other Chinese friends because Jimmy's name is Jimmy Lai. He sounds like your next door neighbor, in Westchester or something. He could live anywhere. It's not an exotic name. And it kind of fits the man. That's who he is.
What does Jimmy's story mean for press freedom?
It's bad right now. Some of the press associations have been good in terms of fighting this, but it's not a hopeful sign. I mean, it's incredible to me that British colonial government, foreigners, could be less worried about bad press than the Chinese. The Chinese, by meaning in China, the leadership, the People's Republic, they're afraid of Chinese. They're afraid of free-thinking Chinese people. And that's why they do everything to shut it down. Jimmy's been in jail for 5 years. The government's had all this time to build his case. What have they proved? They proved that Jimmy is an energetic newspaper publisher who believes passionately in freedom. I think it's really a disgrace.
What responsibility do multinational companies and investors have when it comes to China and Hong Kong, the way in which China has squashed these freedoms?
Well, I think, first of all, we need to put the blame where it belongs on the government of China and the government of Hong Kong, which has systematically gone through laws that protected Chinese people and preserved freedom, and they've tried to dismantle them. That's not because of Western companies or something going in there. The foreign investment was once seen as a great guarantor of Hong Kong's freedom because, as the saying goes, would China want to kill the goose that lays the golden eggs? I think they don't want to kill it, but if it needs to be killed to keep them in power, they'll do it. So I think what they need to raise their voices on is the rule of law. We've had so many erosions, and business in Hong Kong has thrived because of the rule of law. And that is precisely what's threatened. I wrote a book on Hong Kong about 30 years ago. And what I predicted in that book, and I did not know of these events, could not even imagine, is that the tragedy of Hong Kong post-1997 would be becoming just another Chinese city. It was so much more than that, so special. And sadly, those of us who loved it now watch it erode. I mean, I feel like Ashley Wilkes in Gone with the Wind watching this whole way of life just slide off into the sunset and forever change. And we know in Hong Kong's case, for the worse.
Where's Jimmy's family right now?
Well, they're spread out. They have different commitments. One son lives in Taiwan. I think his daughter splits her time between the U.S. and London, and he has a son also in the U.S. And Teresa, of course, has a home in Hong Kong, and she stays there because she wants to visit her husband, and she's a faithful visitor. She goes, and she knows him. If you know Jimmy, she's his rock. He keeps her alive every time going in there. I know it's very hard for her. She probably thinks she's not doing any good, but I know Jimmy, and as a friend, if you wanted, the best thing he could do is have his wife around him. That and his faith is what gives him strength, and real strength.
So Jimmy used to always talk about religion, but like a lot of Chinese, he really didn't have any religion. He was very pro-religion in general, but didn't have any.
Well, my wife is a very devout Catholic, so I went to church for a long time.
Hong Kong was the place where Chinese Christians were freest, in the world.
I think what he found in Teresa was a rock, was a stability, was a reason to see the moral purpose of his life.
I was a bit apprehensive about what's going to happen after the takeover. A lot of people rumor that I will be arrested, some people will be arrested, I will be this and that, and maybe that kind of security that sets into my psyche. That made up my mind to be baptized. Whenever I'm in crisis, I feel I'm going to be okay. I live in grace. And this is what faith gave me.
Before we started recording, you mentioned that the conviction from 3 days ago, from when we're recording this, was fully expected, but now is where the hope really starts to bubble up, is kind of the way in which you described it. Talk about that.
Well, in some way, yes, conviction is bad, but we knew it 5 years ago when he's arrested. They built him up to be like the Osama bin Laden of Hong Kong. They're not going to just say, never mind, he's innocent. So we all knew he's going to be convicted, and he finally was. And frankly, it's been an obstacle. In some ways, it's good news in that this had to come first before the efforts to get him out of prison. China and Hong Kong were not going to allow him to be released before conviction. If they let him go, they want to be able to say, out of the goodness of our hearts, compassion for his old age and illness, we released a traitor, Jimmy Lai, who was convicted in a court of law of sedition and colluding with foreign forces. That's what they want for their own little theater. So now it begins. Donald Trump promised during the campaign that he would get Jimmy out. He promised it would be easy. He backed off a little on the easy part. But in fairness, the Trump administration is working on this case. They're having meetings, and he said he'll try, and he said it publicly. So he's obviously a great admirer of Jimmy Lai, and Jimmy's in jail. Jimmy is very pro-American. He wasn't a spy or anything. He was a newspaper guy that liked America because he loved liberty, and he's vocal. And I think President Trump knows that and wants to help. We'll see what he can do. I don't know what the trade would be for, but, with Donald Trump going to China in April, I think it's a good time for this issue to come up. And freeing Jimmy Lai, what Trump needs to realize, he's offering China a gift. They have a man who's now 78, just turned 78, has diabetes, has his teeth falling out, his nails turning purple, according to his kids who visited him, all sorts of health problems. Do they really want him to die in prison and be a martyr? I don't think so. Donald Trump is offering him a way out. a facing way out that would allow them to let him go, maybe get something for it. So Trump is doing him a favor. Think of it. When Trump visits, that's going to be a big deal in China. And there'll be a lot of press with Trump. Does China really want much of the trip being taken up? What are you doing with Jimmy Lai? When are you going to let Jimmy Lai out? How come you're not letting him out? It could be a real spoiler. You know, a little bit of history. After Tiananmen Square, there was an astrophysicist named Li Fangzhou, and he sought refuge in the U.S. Embassy. He was hiding in the U.S. Embassy, and China was demanding his return. So it was a stalemate. We're not going to turn him over to the Chinese authorities. And nothing was happening. Nixon wrote Deng Xiaoping a letter, and based on his old friendship. And he said, look, we're never going to see eye to eye on communism, all sorts of things. But this is not helping you, that this guy is holed up in our embassy. The best thing for you would be to let him go. Yes, he'll get a lot of attention right away, but when he's free, he won't quite have the power that he has now as a hunted man and so forth. And I think that applies to Jimmy Lai too. Okay, they've convicted him. Now what do they do with him? We have international bodies from the European Parliament. I think the G7 just issued a statement. Everyone knows this trial is a crock, that Jimmy Lai should be free. And I don't see what it gets China. And they could also blame it on Hong Kong. Beijing didn't arrest him and do that. It was Hong Kong. And I think they haven't thought it all the way through.
As viewers, listeners, people that watch this film, I'm sure that they'll ask the question, okay, this is all fine and dandy. I mean, I feel really bad. This is tragic. What can I do?
I don't know that ordinary people can. I think the fact that the film, The Hong Konger, that was one of the biggest things in publicizing Jimmy's name. I mean, how many people in America can be expected to know a Chinese newspaper publisher in Hong Kong? Not many. But it brought Jimmy's message appeals. One, it appeals to free market types because he's very free market, basically almost libertarian. So it appeals to like the Cato Institute types, the champions of free markets. Two, it appeals to democracy champions because Jimmy has always been an advocate of democracy for Hong Kong and so forth. And third, it appeals to Christians around the world who see a fellow believer thrown in jail for no good reason. Remember, Jimmy's been in jail 5 years, now 78. Most of that 5 years has been spent in solitary confinement. That does funny things to a man. I don't like being home for a weekend without my wife. You just have to marvel at Jimmy's resilience.
How should we evaluate success 5 or 10 years from now?
Well, I'm more interested in success 5 months from now. And my evaluation is Jimmy going to be free? Again, President Trump said it would be easy back in the campaign. To me, that's the only measure that matters. Get him out. Do we have any clout with China? Can we get him out? It would give a lot of hope to a lot of other people in jail if we could get Jimmy out. Also, Jimmy's their big leader. From the Chinese point of view, the Hong Kong government, he's public enemy number one. They built their case about enemies of state, and Jimmy's the leader of all of it. And if you let him go, there's not as much need to keep the others in jail so long. So there's lots of people in jail for, what we would think are minor offenses. Wouldn't even be an offense for lighting a candle at a Tiananmen service. This is not the Hong Kong people knew and loved.
What did you think about the film?
I love the film because I thought it was a good way to bring Jimmy as a person home to people who knew a little bit about his plight, but had more explanation as told by the people that knew him. So I thought it was very good. And it came, particularly the timing, it came at an important time. Jimmy's given a lot of interviews over the years, but this combined it with, reflections after he was arrested. I mean, I don't think Donald Trump would be bringing his case up without that kind of film out there and that pressure. People around the world know him as a hero because he championed the ideals that they share with them and went to jail for them.
If you had one question you wish more journalists would ask about Hong Kong or talk about Hong Kong, what would that be?
I would ask, what's the link between this and their prosperity? They take it for granted they can do any of this stuff and behave like China and still lay those golden eggs. But I wonder, you hear all sorts of stories that are not covered about businesses fleeing and people not investing. I would like to see a little more coverage. What is the economic price that Hong Kong, what's the ideal place to invest in everything? What's the economic price they're paying? Because they rest everything on the economic argument. If they lose that, then the show is over.
Anything else?
No, I think that's pretty much covered it.
All right. Bill McGurn, thank you for being on the Exploration Films podcast.
Thank you.
The number one eyesore for Beijing was always Apple Daily.
Sometimes you need people to kick your ass in business. I was one of the very few guys who was very controversial, who was very outspoken.
Living in the truth is an effective tool against totalitarian power. Speaking truth to power is something that powerful dictatorships are terrified by.
And I think Jimmy understood that. That's why he started the paper. That's why he kept it. That's why he made it into essentially a part of the movement.
Everybody was so chicken out, so scared that they went into self-censorship to avoid offending the communists.
So many businessmen keep quiet because they have investments in China. So Hong Kong people always have a soft spot for a guy willing to speak out as Jimmy does.
Sit around the table with Jimmy Lai. His ability to get to the core of an issue was just phenomenal.
And actually, he gave me the first advice. He said, you know what, if you are fighting for the free market, if you're fighting for freedom, be prepared to be very lonely.
It was a cool thing to work for the Apple Daily because you can do the stories that you like, that you can do investigative journalism.
I promise that I only criticize what they do after they publish it, so there's no censor.
The journalists of Apple Daily have always been on the front lines trying to report the truth, trying to document the history.
The existence of Apple Daily really tells that Hong Kong is special because you can not find a newspaper just like Apple Daily in mainland China.
I was thrilled by the idea that, I can be part of the institution that is delivering freedom.
If I deliver information, I'm in the business of delivering liberty.
Standing up for people's rights in Hong Kong and by denouncing Chinese communism and its opposition to the rule of law and democracy.
I believe that if I do the right thing, the strength will come.
I don't know whether he was perfect or not. All I know, he was extremely brave and stood up for all the sort of things which those of us who live in liberal democracies sometimes take for granted.
Thanks, Mary Kissel, for being on the Exploration Films podcast.
It's great to be with you, Steve.
Mary, let's start with you because you were senior advisor for Mike Pompeo, former Secretary of State. So who are you and where did you come from?
Well, the short story is I'm an American, third-generation Floridian, and I had the privilege of spending almost 15 years on the Wall Street Journal editorial board. And that's how I met Jimmy Lai. I ran the editorial board in Asia from 2005 to 2010. So I got to know him by dint of that role, which was a real gift. But then subsequently to that, As you said, I joined at a senior position at the State Department as a political appointee. And that was around the time when, Hong Kong was, I think, realizing the realities of living under communist rule, a lot of brutality, suppression of freedoms, et cetera. And so I had the chance to interact with Jimmy on that level, coming from a very different point of view, which was the policymaking point of view, and trying to understand what it was that we could potentially do to encourage the respect for rights that, China itself had promised to Hong Kong under the Basic Law, which is their mini constitution that was written before they were handed over from the British to the Chinese.
Within the State Department, how did you see Hong Kong and its trajectory, really? Because everything was all flowers and fireworks, and this is going to be a great transition from the British. Yet a lot of people in the States kind of were like, is it really going to be that way?
Well, Hong Kong was a very important financial center back when I was living there in the mid-2000s, but it diminished in importance as the economy of mainland China grew. And the assumption was always that Hong Kong was going to lead the way for the mainland. It was going to show the mainland how to be prosperous, and that the mandarins in Beijing would adopt free markets and liberalize politically, et cetera, and then provide an example to Taiwan and to induce Taiwan to come and join the motherland because of the great experience that not just Hong Kong, but Macau supposedly would have. And of course, we know that that's not what happened at all. But to your question, Steve, about when did the degradation of freedom start to happen, I saw that as soon as I got over there. It was right after SARS. And I remember having conversations with my editors back in New York, and they said, oh gosh, Mary, isn't it great? Hong Kong's the freest economy in the world. In fact, I was the person that had to go and give those presentations, right? We'd have lunch with the chief executive of Hong Kong and say, hey, congratulations, you're number one. It was done in conjunction with the Heritage Foundation. But even then, they were starting to manipulate local elections, and there were all kinds of signs that they didn't really intend to honor the Basic Law at all. And in fact, they were extremely threatened by Hong Kong's success and by the free press in Hong Kong, their ability to assemble, to worship, all the things that we enjoy in the United States. That was all very threatening to them. But I saw that degradation happening 20 years ago. And so by the time I got to the State Department in 2018, it had progressed.
I'm sure you really brought just a perspective, having actually been there and then.
Well, a lot of that was also due to the education that I got from Jimmy. I mean,
really?
Jimmy Lai, yeah, absolutely. I mean, Jimmy Lai lived the transformation of communist China to freedom. I mean, he was born in the mainland in the late 40s. He came to Hong Kong when he was a teenager. You know the story. And, by dint of his own intelligence, his hard work, his risk-taking, he enjoyed the benefits of those freedoms. Not only did he make a lot of money, but he built a family, a reputation, and he became one of the great philanthropists of Asia Pacific, which is a part of him that I don't think is very well known. And he did it across multiple industries. There were definitely points in his life when this distinction between an unfree society and a free society really shaped him. The first, of course, was escaping to Hong Kong. I think the second was Tiananmen Square, which were massacres that were held in 1989 to put down student-led peaceful protests for freedom. That didn't just happen in Beijing. That happened all over mainland China. And it really deeply impacted Jimmy. And he realized, gosh, we need to have a free press here that's really informing people about what's going on. And that we pivoted from garment making to the media business. I mean, so he's had these sort of seminal moments in his life. And I think the third, unfortunately, was when he was charged many years ago for the quote unquote crime of, demanding that China respect his freedoms as a human being. So he's seen the worst of it, and he's of the unfree society, and he's seen the best of the free societies. He's lived a remarkable life.
I didn't know anything about Jimmy before watching this documentary, and I was really struck at the courage he had to stay when he could have moved to London or America or any one of a number of countries that I'm sure would have brought him in and thus been a voice into Hong Kong from afar. I think of Alexei Navalny in Russia going back when he knew the second he went back he was going to get arrested. Why? You were in the State Department when he was arrested. Were you guys encouraging him to, you got to get out of there, dude?
Oh, no. We didn't have any say over what Jimmy did, nor would we presume to do that. Jimmy's his own man. And what he has said consistently before he was jailed was that he's lived a good life. And that if he didn't stay and set an example and draw attention to really the suffocation of Hong Kong and its people by the communist regime, who would care? Who would pay attention? That was one of many important messages that Jimmy tried to promote and explain before he was put in jail. The other one, of course, was that, this is a very paranoid regime in Beijing that, you can't assume that they want to have a sustainable peace with you because it's not how they see the world. There's a great quote from him. He said, quote, "Whatever they do is warfare because as a dictator, the outside world is always the potential enemy. That's the way they look at the world." That's not well understood, I think, in the West. I mean, you see even today, national leaders going over, trying to appease, pretending they can get, quote unquote deals that they think will be respected by both sides. Jimmy knew that was all nonsense because of the nature of the regime. And I think, the other big message that he tried to convey is that you can't tolerate regimes like this, that they don't stay where they are, and that if you appease them, they will simply expand like a cancer. And we are seeing that. And it's not as obvious as in the Soviet period, because in the Soviet period, the Soviets made every country that they conquered look exactly like the Soviet system, right? That was the Iron Curtain. It was distinct between East and West. But it's not like that with regimes that China has infiltrated and corrupted. They're not necessarily exporting exactly the same system. They're just corrupting the other system to do what they want. It's very insidious, and it extends even to the United States, to Britain, to other Western democracies. And they do it through buying people off, and not necessarily in a corrupt way, just to say, hey, let's make money together. It's a, quote, win-win. You'll hear that a lot in conversations about relationships with China. And as long as you make money, you should just ignore everything that we're doing to our own people, like Jimmy Lai. And you should ignore what our designs are on our near abroad and on you and what we're doing inside your borders. And so I think Jimmy was not just courageous, but a hero for having really the self-sacrifice to give up his life, his wife, his children, his business, everything, to sound that warning. And I think it's incumbent on everyone to hear these messages and to really deeply understand what he was trying to convey and why it matters to you.
It's significant that, Jimmy and my father and others, for 30 years, they kept and led the Tiananmen Vigil in Victoria Park.
They've had vigils ever since then, which are a real sore spot for China.
These were always sores in Beijing's eyes. The first opportunities they got to take these eyesores, they took it. The Hong Kong authorities used the excuse of the COVID-19 to begin denying people the permit to organize, to protest. Jimmy Lai and other people, they show up at the Victoria Park at the candlelight vigil.
Now the possibility of putting me in jail is more probable than before.
What circumstances does Jimmy Lai get out of Hong Kong?
I will not get out of Hong Kong because I'm one of the troublemakers. I can't make the trouble and then go. I cannot do that. Well,
you talk about the corrupting influence. What kind of responsibility do multinational companies and shareholders have to try and hold China accountable?
Really, it's first incumbent on government to set clear red lines for companies, right? And they do that in certain circumstances. For instance, Hong Kong can't be sold dual-use technologies, so you can't sell missile parts into Hong Kong, right? Because it's part of mainland China. You can't trade nuclear material with Iran, right? There are many examples of this where government has said, hey, this is an enemy state. And so as such, there are all these decisions and rules that cascade down from that. And so that's where the problem originates, is that we don't have clarity on how we as a U.S. government, I can only speak for the U.S. government point of view, how we view Beijing, largely because our systems are intertwined, because we don't have the same sorts of information that we get out of other places. Our journalists can't go where they want. We can't talk to anybody on the street. Diplomats can't do it. Corporate leaders can't do it. So there's propaganda coming out, but there's no translators can't really go in. And we're in this strange gray area where we now have bipartisan consensus on Capitol Hill, thanks to people like Jimmy, who have stood up and really factually explained, hey, this is what this regime is and what they say they want to each other and to their people. So we have that bipartisan consensus on Capitol Hill that China is an adversary, but we haven't yet taken that next step to say, hey, they're an enemy. And so that's why I think a lot of companies and investors find themselves in a difficult position. Their job is not to think about global politics. I would love to say everyone's a patriotic CEO. I think many people are. But, it's not an easy thing to pull out of a country immediately. And in some circumstances, you can't. I mean, in some circumstances, the decision is, well, you don't have a business anymore. And so if decoupling is not going to happen short of a conflict or short of a decision where the United States says, guys, everybody has to get out. And that generally takes a war. And I hope we don't have that. I wish we were more prudent, but, the other issue that we face as a democracy is, our democracy works slowly. It's designed that way. We're designed to have debates and checks and balances. And so we prosecute our agenda for our national interest in a slow, measured way, usually unless something bad happens, like Pearl Harbor or 9/11. Communist China is different. Their only goal is to preserve the power of the party and to expand it. And that's it. Everything is about the party. It's not about the people of China. It's not about sustainable trade. It's not about improving people's lives. It's none of that. They have a brutal system. If they don't like someone, they just throw them in a black hole somewhere. So it's two very different sets of imperatives. And I think Jimmy Lai should be read and talked about very widely because he just understood so well the depth and the breadth of the threat that we face from them.
From your vantage point in diplomacy and policy, what leverage points actually move the needle and what's just fluff?
Totalitarian regimes only understand power, period. They don't understand nicety. They don't understand diplomacy. They certainly view appeasement as weakness. And so in the first Trump term, we talked about fairness and reciprocity, that if we sign a contract or an agreement, it must be respected. And that has a direct impact on the kind of court that Jimmy Lai was subjected to, right? He was tried in under the national security law, which is effectively a kangaroo court that makes a mockery of the British system that Hong Kong inherited, that is political in its motivation, that ignores any kind of fact and certainly doesn't give expedient trials to people. And so it starts with demanding that China live up to the promises that it made. That's number one. Number two, if they don't do those things, then you have to identify, well, what's meaningful to them? What's meaningful to party elites is basically three things. Their lives, because they're not democratically elected and they've tortured and killed a lot of people angry at them. Their money, they're incredibly corrupt and they've stashed money all over the country and the world. And their power and their influence. And so those are the three levers. But you don't even have to go there. You just have to start standing up and saying, you've never honored any agreement that you've ever signed. You can start as a measure of good faith by releasing Jimmy Lai and allowing him to spend his final days with his family. And then you have to go around the world and talk to your allies, friends, and partners and say, we all face this problem. It's not a bilateral US-China problem. It's a free world versus totalitarianism problem. And we need to prevail because our system is superior. It is a morally better system. And we have to be courageous enough to stand up and say that. And that was another message of Jimmy's. He said, you have to have confidence in the superiority of your own system. And we have gotten out of the habit of doing that. Reagan used to do that. He would stand up and say, how do I think of the Soviets? We win, you lose. Our system is better. And we have to regain that confidence in freedom. And that's something else that I think Jimmy very eloquently not only preached, but lives with his life.
What mistakes has the United States made governmentally in its relationship with China since you've been gone almost 5 years now?
Oh, I don't know if that's the prism. We had Republican and Democrat administrations over a period of more than 4 decades reach out in a very sincere way to try to have not just a peaceful relationship, but a mutually beneficial relationship with China. And I think, if there were one mistake, it's probably that we didn't talk over the regime to the Chinese people, right? This is always what dictators want. They want you to engage with them directly. They want you to ignore how people really feel. And the Chinese people do not have a way to express themselves without fear of imprisonment, torture, or death. The only time we ever get even a hint of a true feeling of what's going on inside China is when they get so upset or threatened that they get out onto the streets. And we've seen that repeatedly. We saw it with the Democracy Wall protests in the late 70s. We saw it in 89, the Tiananmen Square protests that were national. We saw it with the Charter 08 movement right before the Beijing Olympics. We saw it again in Hong Kong, where millions of people, we're talking massive percentages of the population, got out onto the streets peacefully. That's the only time that you can really see how they feel about this brutal and corrupt system. And so that's what we have to pay attention to. And I think one of the big mistakes was to just focus on these elite to elite conversations that are very tempting to do when you're in a position of power, because you think you know what's best, but you don't have a full picture if you're not talking to other parts of the society or not insisting on talking to other parts of the society.
So the Hong Kong government withdrew the extradition bill under pressure, but the issues that gave rise to it and the resentments and the reaction to the violence and all those things were kept festering. And that's what then gave rise unexpectedly to where we are today with the national security law.
In the film, there's a really poignant moment. I think it's one of the most powerful in the entire documentary. You get emotional talking about Jimmy and Hong Kong. Where does that emotion come from?
He's just a beautiful person. The idea that somebody like that has been subjected to essentially a solitary confinement for 5 years, and God knows how much longer after he's sentenced. For what? I think I got emotional because I know what a fine person he is, what a generous and decent person he is. But I also find it just so deeply troubling because this is the kind of person. Imagine if China allowed people like Jimmy to flourish. You know how many Jimmy Lais would be in mainland China? And all the good that they could do for the Chinese people and the world. Can you imagine what a force for good China would be? That's a tragedy for the world. And, the people who suffer the most are the people we can't see, we can't hear, the people we will never know. During the first term, for instance, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo declared crimes against humanity and genocide against China for what they're doing to the Uyghur people and other ethnically Muslim peoples in Western China. And, to think that that's going on today and we don't give it a second thought is horrifying. who are we as human beings if we don't take action or care or hold people to account for doing that? That's shocking. I mean, it is shocking. So yeah, I'm emotional about it. I think it's a human tragedy. It's a moral tragedy. And it could be avoided, right? I mean, it's just, you've just got a handful of people running this country, really one in the form of Chairman Xi Jinping, just inflicting all of this unnecessary misery and chaos and destruction on the world. And we should talk about it. We should understand it. And we should confront it. That's what Jimmy was trying to do in a peaceful way.
Who was Jimmy to you personally? Any stories?
Yeah, I mean, I was fortunate to meet him because of the job that I had. You know, he knew every editor of the editorial page of the journal in Hong Kong, you know, going back many years. And so I remember I met him the first time, but my predecessor invited me. He said, you know, you got to meet this guy. He's going to have us over for lunch. And so we took a car up to Kowloon. Left Hong Kong Island and over to the peninsula of Kowloon, up to his house. And, you know, from the front, the house looks very kind of modest. There was a fence, but you couldn't really even see the front of the house. Walked in, and he just couldn't have been warmer. He took us out to the back. He had almost like an I don't know if arboretum is the right word, like a greenhouse.
Yeah.
Kind of set up. And we sat down at this big table with a lazy Susan, and the food started coming, and it kept coming, and it kept coming. And I don't know, I think we had maybe 10, 15 courses of food. I mean, I could barely sit up. I had eaten so much food. And I was just so struck. He was so curious about why we believed in free markets and free people. And, you know, he was a lot of fun to be around, clearly in love with his family. He was very different from the other Hong Kong tycoons, as I learned over the years, because I'd get invited to, you know, these fancy events, and, you know, it was like a contest to show how much money they had made. But Jimmy wasn't like that. He couldn't care less. He never went to those things. He just wanted to work and then go home to his family and spend as much time as possible with them and worship. He's a devout Catholic. He was a convert to Catholicism. Steve, I think you've talked to his godfather, Bill McGurn, who's one of my former colleagues and good friends. And so Jimmy, to me, was a mentor. He was a teacher. He was a friend. He still is. And he should be an inspiration, I think, to many around the world who can't speak up. You know, I think Jimmy speaks for a lot of Chinese people who, you know, don't have the means or the courage or the ability to reach important audiences who need to hear these truths about Beijing. And I feel like it was just such a blessing to meet him and to get to know him. It's really one of the privileges of my life.
If you could speak directly to Hong Kongers, to the diaspora, what do you want them to hear?
Well, that the West hasn't forgotten about them, that if they can leave, they should, until China is free, and that the ultimate goal should be a free China, because that's the only way that they will ever be able to live a peaceful and prosperous life. And that, you know, people in the West and the free world hope and pray that someday that they will achieve that and they will be able to enjoy all the freedoms that we have and that we take for granted, really.
People who are competent and people who have independent thoughts are leaving the city. They are leaving.
And we can see that the city itself is dying.
Very sad.
The hope was that China would evolve in that 50 years to catch up to where Hong Kong is. That has obviously been reversed.
Now China's just erasing the distinctions, erasing the advantage Hong Kong had in rule of law, in market openness, in lack of corruption.
So I think it's a much more dangerous place and a much more unreliable place to be doing business.
We can't wait for the 50 years. You know, the one country, two system is going to end very soon.
And we're less than halfway through that period, and China effectively has torn up that treaty. They say that it's a historic document of no relevance.
A China that does not respect the right of its people will not respect the right of its neighbors. That is the trouble we are facing.
For viewers who watch this film and they ask, what can I do? What advice do you have for them?
Well, it depends on, where you are and what you do for a living and what means you have. I mean, certainly if you're running a company or if you're a capital allocator, you're an investor, is to go and really examine who are you doing business with and where is that money going? A totalitarian regime does not have a private sector. Even if you're making shoes like Nike, those profits and revenues ultimately filter up to the party. I mean, yes, they are to some degree helping average Chinese people who are working in the factories, but the entire system in the capital is contained within China for a reason. There's a reason why they have strict capital controls. It's because the party controls the money. So step number one is, recognize who you're doing business with and be honest about it, make choices accordingly. Secondly, make your voices known to your local representatives or senators if you agree with Jimmy's point of view. I think third, also recognize that the threat is in the United States as well. We've been deeply infiltrated. Our critical infrastructure has been compromised. The Chinese have engaged in hacks that allow them to listen to our phone calls, read the texts of our messages. We don't know why they're doing this, but that's something that we need to raise awareness of. And at the same time, we have to be sensitive that we have really amazing Chinese American citizens who contribute greatly to our society. So we have to distinguish between the party and the Chinese people, right? That's very, very important. But I think it just starts with recognizing the reality of what we're dealing with. And as I said earlier in our conversation, Steve, we're in a transitional period of history in a gray area where officially we view Beijing as neither a friend nor an enemy. And we have these silly constructions that we're supposed to cooperate when we can and compete where we must, compete. And then we have confront where we must. So cooperate, compete, confront. What does that mean? That's a nonsense. So it's confused. And we get confused policymaking as a result. So, we need to encourage our political class to clarify that and fast while we still can.
What sorts of indicators should we be looking for to see things are starting to trend in the right direction for Hong Kong and China?
It's not going to trend in the right direction under the communists. There's no indication of that. And I don't say that as a partisan matter. I say that simply as someone who has lived there and observed the data and the history. As the party has gained more money, influence, military prowess, it has become more aggressive toward its people and its neighbors and us. And Xi Jinping, so you have to look at what are they building, how are they using it as they build it, and how do they say they're going to use it in the future? And that all points in one direction, toward becoming more and more aggressive and destructive and paranoid. So I don't see a better future here unless there's a change in the regime.
How does that happen, barring a war?
Who knows? We're terrible as a country predicting these things. We missed the fall of the Soviet Union. We didn't see the Arab Spring coming. We didn't see the 2008 Iranian protests, which were very courageous. We didn't see the fall of Syria and the Assad regime more recently. We don't see these things coming. I mean, it comes from within China. And people getting frustrated with, their lack of upward mobility, the brutality, the corruption, the impediments on their freedom to worship and assemble and to just live normal lives. I mean, when you've got a hall monitor down the hallway from you coming to your door and saying, hey, if you don't pay me 800 yuan, I'm going to report you to the authorities and I'll throw your dad in jail for 6 months. I mean, who wants to live like that? Nobody does. So I think if the change comes, it'll come from the Chinese people.
What's one question that Western journalists should be asking but rarely do when it comes to China, Hong Kong.
Of whom? I think the question is of whom. I mean, I think if you're asking U.S. officials, it would be what evidence do you have at all in any fora, international organizations, military to military attempts to connect with them, trade relationship, commercial dealings. What evidence do you have that they are living up to their promises and pledges, whether they're bilateral or multilateral? Show me the evidence. That's a question I wish would always be asked, right? Because the answer is zero. But if you answer that question as zero evidence, that's very uncomfortable, because then you have to acknowledge, wait a second, they don't want to cooperate with us. We have to get over what I call our strategic narcissism, which is we see them for what we think they should be. We need to see them for what they are. And Jimmy understands that because he was born in the middle of the chaos of the new communist regime, because he fled to Hong Kong and he saw what freedom looked like. And then he's suffered at the end of his life and is suffering now to warn people about how this is developing.
He was arrested in 2020. Now officially the sentence, or not the sentencing, but the charges, the verdict was just announced earlier this week. Bill McGurn was very optimistic, saying now he's no longer in this kind of limbo phase, but now is when the State Department can come in and start to try and negotiate getting him out as part of a trade. He's pretty optimistic. Where do you sit on that?
Well, first of all, it should be the Brits that are doing this. He's a British citizen, not an American citizen, even though he has many American friends. So the onus is actually not on the State Department, it's on the Foreign Office in the UK. And they have shown themselves to be absolutely feckless. They have no interest in helping Jimmy at all. And I think that is a national shame. And I think it's very short-sighted because, as I said earlier, there's no evidence that Communist China shares our values or strategic interests, no evidence that they want a sustainable peace or anything like that. And so the State Department's first reaction will be, well, why aren't you guys doing that? President Trump, to his great credit, has talked about Jimmy publicly and said that he would get him out. But, that's dependent on which way talks go and how far Xi Jinping tries to push him before their tentatively scheduled meeting next April. The Chinese have kept other dissidents in jail till they died before. Remember Liu Xiaobo, the famous Chinese poet, whose wife fled to Germany, but they kept him, and he died in prison. And Jimmy is different because Jimmy speaks English. He has a network of friends in the West who are in powerful roles politically or in television or other places, so he can get his message out. So while I share Bill's hope that Jimmy gets out as soon as possible, I don't think I'm as optimistic as he is, unfortunately, that it's going to happen. I think it would, you asked what people could do. I think, writing to President Trump and saying, please raise his case as you said you would, get him out as you said you would. It would be a great triumph for freedom and for America if you did, and for China and for the Chinese people.
Mary Kissel, thank you so much for being on the Exploration Films podcast. Any closing thoughts? Any final thoughts?
I just want everyone to pray for Jimmy and to keep his family in your prayers, because it's not just, he's not the only one who was impacted by this ordeal. And to honor him, to talk about him, and to internalize these messages and educate other people about what has happened to him and what that says about the regime in Beijing and what it means for our futures if we don't confront it.
America's founders closed their declaration with that promise: lives, fortune, sacred honor. Placed on the line with a reliance on providence, Jimmy Lai made a similar pledge, and tonight he sits in a cell for it. If this conversation moved you, pray. Pray for Jimmy by name. Pray for Teresa. Pray for strength, protection, and release. Then share this story. And watch The Hong Konger on the Exploration Films platform, exploreflix.com. That's explore, Flix.com. So many more people need to see what courage looks like when it costs. History reminds us that freedom doesn't survive on comfort, it survives on conviction. May we be the kind of people who don't look away, who speak up, who remember those in chains as if we were there with them. I'm Steve Ryder. Thank you to Mary Kissel and Bill McGurn, and thank you for listening. Until next time, stay watchful, stay prayerful, and keep telling stories that set people free.
That's a wrap.